The first time Clara Whitmore saw Ethan Hale, he was bleeding in the middle of Redridge's main street, and not a single soul moved to help him. Two men were laughing. One had his boot pressed into Ethan's chest. The other was spitting on the ground beside his face. And Ethan Hale was not fighting back. Not because he couldn't. Clara would learn that truth far too late, after the rumors had already done their damage, and Redridge had already made up its mind about the quietest man in town. If this story already has you leaning forward, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. The summer of 1874 came to Redridge, Texas, like a punishment. The heat pressed down on everything, on the wooden storefronts, on the cracked dirt roads, on the people who had learned long ago not to expect mercy from this land. Dust hung in the air all morning and all afternoon, and when the wind came, it didn't cool anything. It just moved the heat from one place to another. Clara Whitmore had been on the stagecoach for 11 hours. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the road. Her back ached, and her hands were folded tight in her lap, and her jaw was set in the way it had been set for the past 8 months, ever since the letter came about Robert. Ever since she had stood in a churchyard in Abilene and watched them put her husband into the ground, and felt, underneath the grief, something that scared her. Something that felt almost like relief, and then felt guilty about the relief, and then felt numb about the guilt. She had been numb for a long time now. She was coming home to Redridge because there was nowhere else to go. Her mother was gone. Her father was gone. But the old house still stood on the edge of town, and she still owned it. And right now, standing still felt like the only thing she could manage. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the general store, and Clara climbed down and put her 2 bags on the ground and straightened her hat and looked at the town she had left 6 years ago. Redridge looked exactly the same. That was the first thing she noticed. And then she heard the laughter. It was ugly laughter, the kind that meant someone was enjoying something they shouldn't. She turned. 2 men stood in front of the Silver Spur Saloon, maybe 40 feet away. One of them, broad-shouldered, red-faced, with a hat pushed back on his head, had his boot on the chest of a man lying in the dirt. The other one was crouched down, saying something Clara couldn't hear, grinning wide. The man on the ground was not moving. He was tall, she could see that even lying down. Lean, dark hair, dusty. A deep cut above his left eye was bleeding slow. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the ground, not raised, not swinging, not even flinching. And around them, maybe a dozen people stood watching. Not one of them moved. Clara dropped her bags and walked forward. "Stop," she said. Her voice came out louder than she intended. The laughter cut off. The red-faced man with his boot on the other man's chest looked up. "Stop that right now," Clara said. She was still walking toward them. She wasn't sure why. She had always been the kind of woman who stepped toward things that frightened her. Robert had called it stubbornness. She had called it the inability to pretend she wasn't seeing what she was seeing. The crouching man stood up and tilted his head at her. He had a lazy grin and mean eyes. "You new here, man?" "I'm not new. I'm just back." She stopped a few feet from them. "Get your boot off of him." The red-faced man looked down at the man in the dirt, then back at her. He didn't move his boot. "Don't trouble yourself, ma'am. This here is just Quiet Ethan." He said the name like it was a joke. "He don't mind." "He's bleeding." "He started it." The grin again. "Well, he started it by existing, mostly." A few people in the gathered crowd laughed. Nervous laughter. The kind that meant people knew something was wrong, but had already decided not to be the one to say so. Clara looked down at the man in the dirt. He was looking at her. Not with shame, not with pleading. His eyes were dark and still and very calm. There was a cut on his lip to go with the one above his eye, and his shirt had a tear at the shoulder, and he was lying in the summer dust of Redridge's main street, and his expression was the most controlled thing Clara had ever seen on a human face. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. "Get up," the red-faced man said, and kicked lightly at the man's ribs. Not hard, just dismissive. The way you'd nudge an animal. "Get up and go home, Ethan. You got nothing to offer here." The man in the dirt, Ethan, turned his eyes away from Clara and slowly, without rushing, pushed himself up onto one knee, then stood. He was taller than she'd thought. His hands hung loose at his sides. He looked at the red-faced man with that same flat, still expression, and then without a word, he picked up his hat from the dirt, put it on, and walked away. He didn't look back at Clara. He didn't look back at any of them. He just walked. The crowd scattered. The two men went back into the saloon, already laughing again about something else. Clara stood in the middle of the street, with dust settling around her boots and the sound of the stagecoach driver unloading her bags behind her. And she watched the quiet man turn the corner at the end of the street and disappear. She stood there for a moment longer than she meant to. The woman who ran the boarding house was named Mrs. Ida Pratt, and she had opinions about everyone in Redridge, and she shared them freely and at length. "You need anything at all, you just ask me," Ida said, setting a glass of water on the small table in Clara's room. "I've been here 20 years. I know every soul in this town." "I grew up here," Clara said, setting her bag on the bed. Ida didn't seem to hear this. "You'll want to know who to trust and who to avoid," she continued. "That's always the first thing." Clara sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress was thin, but the room was clean. Outside the window, the heat shimmered off the rooftops. "I think I can manage that myself." "Of course you can. But you've been gone, haven't you?" Ida folded her hands. "There's a type in this town. Men who look capable but aren't. Women who look friendly but aren't. You learn to read people." Clara thought about the man in the street, the cut above his eye, the way he'd stood up without rushing. "The man this afternoon," she said, "in front of the saloon. Ethan." Ida's expression shifted immediately. Something careful and practiced moved across her face. "Ethan Hale. What's his story?" "Well," Ida took a breath that suggested she had told this story before and was prepared to tell it again. "He's been here about 10 years. Came from somewhere up north. Works at Samuel Carter's ranch, out on the East Road. Good with horses, they say. Very good." She paused. "But quiet. Strange quiet. Doesn't drink at the saloon. Doesn't join in much of anything. People talk, you know." "People were kicking him in the street," Clara said. "That's a little more than talk." Ida looked almost uncomfortable for a moment. Then the practiced expression came back. "Those boys are rough, I'll grant you that. But Ethan, he doesn't do himself any favors, you understand. A man who won't defend himself, won't speak up for himself, people take that a certain way." She lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the room. "They say he's weak. Not in body exactly, but in spirit. You know what I mean. A man who lets himself be walked on isn't really a man." Clara looked at her for a moment. "That's an interesting thing to say about someone you don't seem to know very well." Ida blinked. "Well, I'm just telling you what people say." "I know," Clara said. "That was my point." She spent the first few days settling back into Redridge slowly, the way you re-enter cold water, one step at a time, waiting for your body to adjust. Her house needed work. The porch boards were soft in 2 places, and the kitchen pump was stiff, and 3 windows wouldn't close all the way. She made a list and started at the top and kept herself busy, which was how she had learned to grief. Keep your hands occupied, and your mind will follow eventually. She went to the general store. She went to the church to speak with the pastor. She relearned the rhythm of a small town. Who ate breakfast at the counter in the trading post? Who walked the street at what hours? Which horses belonged to which families? And she started noticing Ethan Hale. Not in the way she expected to notice someone. Not because he was loud or demanding, or present in the way that men in small towns often tried to be. She noticed him because he kept appearing in places and doing things that nobody seemed to see. On the second morning, she walked past old Tom Hadley's fence, the one that ran along the creek road, half collapsed since last winter's ice, and everyone had been stepping around the gap for months. Ethan was there at 6 in the morning, with a post hole digger and a stack of new timber, working quietly and steadily, and Tom Hadley was nowhere to be seen. When Clara stopped and looked, Ethan glanced up briefly, touched the brim of his hat, and went back to work. He didn't say anything. On the fourth day, she was at the livery when a horse came in with a badly wrapped leg wound. Some traveling family passing through, the wife near tears, the husband standing helpless. Ethan was there. He didn't announce himself. He just came forward, crouched down beside the horse, unwrapped the bad bandage, and started working. He spoke to the horse the entire time, very low, just a murmur. The horse, which had been tossing its head and stamping, went still inside 2 minutes. When he was done, he stood up and told the husband what to watch for and when to change the wrapping, and he did it simply and clearly, and without making the man feel foolish for not knowing. The traveling family thanked him. The husband shook his hand. Ethan nodded and walked back to the water trough. Clara stood in the shadow of the livery doorway and watched him, and thought about what Ida Pratt had said about weak men, and felt something tight and specific in her chest. She had been married to a man everyone admired. Robert Whitmore had been charming and broad and loud with laughter at dinner tables. He had slapped backs and told good stories, and people had liked him instantly, everywhere they went. She had liked him instantly too, once. But in 6 years of marriage, she had learned the difference between a man who performed strength and a man who actually had it. She had learned it slowly and painfully, and in ways she still couldn't quite make herself say out loud. She watched Ethan Hale walk away from the livery, unhurried, and she thought, "That man is not weak." She ran into him directly on the 5th day. She was coming out of the general store with a paper bag of flour tucked under one arm, and he was coming in, and they met in the doorway, and both stepped the same direction, and then the other direction, the way people do, and Clara almost laughed, despite herself. "Sorry," she said. "My fault, ma'am." His voice was low and even. Texas in it, but not thick. He stepped aside and held the door. She stepped through and then turned back, because she had been thinking about what she'd seen over the past several days, and she was not the kind of woman who let things sit without addressing them. "You're Ethan Hale," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Clara Whitmore. I've been back in town about a week." "I know," he said. And then, before she could react to that, "You grew up here. The Whitmore house on the old creek road. Your father used to keep a gray mule named Absalom." Something shifted briefly in his expression, almost a smile. "I heard the mule had a better temperament than the man." Clara stared at him. "Who told you that?" "Samuel Carter. He knew your father." "Old Sam," Clara said slowly. "I used to steal apples from his orchard." "He knows that, too." Now the almost smile was definite. Small, but real. "He says you were the worst thief he ever caught, because you always left the door open behind you." Clara felt, for the first time in 8 months, something warm move through her chest. Not big, just a small ember of something. She didn't know what to do with it, so she shifted her flower bag to the other arm and said, "You fixed Tom Hadley's fence." The almost smile disappeared. He looked at her evenly. "Fence needed fixing. Tom Hadley didn't ask you to. He's got a bad back. Hasn't been able to for 2 seasons. You didn't tell him you did it." A pause, then, "He knows." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The sun was behind her. His eyes in the light were dark brown, very steady. The cut above his eye had mostly healed, just a thin line now. "The other day," she said, "in the street—" "You don't need to bring that up, ma'am." "I'm not going to apologize for stepping in, if that's what you're worried about." "I'm not worried about it." His voice was level. "And I didn't need you to step in." "No," Clara said. "I noticed that. You didn't need anyone to step in. You just chose not to fight them." He looked at her for a moment longer than she expected. "Most things don't need to be fought," he said. "Just weathered." He touched the brim of his hat, stepped past her into the store, and was gone. Clara stood on the wooden sidewalk in the August heat of Redridge and thought about that for a very long time. Chapter 2. What she didn't know, what she would learn only in pieces, slowly, over the weeks that followed, was what had built those words in Ethan Hale. She learned the first piece from Samuel Carter himself, when she drove out to the old ranch to look at a horse she'd heard he might be willing to sell. Samuel Carter was 73 years old and moved like a man who had been arguing with his body for a decade and was slowly losing. He was thin in the way of old age, with white hair under a battered hat and eyes that were still sharp as new wire. He offered her coffee without asking and poured it strong. "You want to know about Ethan?" he said, before she'd asked. Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "I'm that obvious?" "You're a woman who looks directly at things," he said. "It's noticeable in this town. Not everyone does." He settled into his chair. "What have they told you?" "That he's quiet and strange and probably weak." Samuel Carter made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite disgust. Something in between. "They've been saying that since he got here. Ethan Hale rode in from the north 10 years ago, and he didn't drink, and he didn't brag, and he didn't fight when people pushed him. And in Red Ridge, Texas, in 1874, that combination of things reads one particular way to most people." He looked at his coffee cup. "It reads wrong. But they read it." "And what does it actually read?" Clara said. Samuel was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was choosing what to say and what to hold back. "Ethan served as a frontier army scout for 6 years, he said finally. "Indian wars up in the territories. He was very good at what he did. They sent him places other men wouldn't go, ahead of the main column, sometimes alone for days. He brought men back alive who should have died." He paused. "He's seen things that most of the men in Redridge couldn't sit with for 5 minutes. He knows what violence costs. He knows exactly what he could do to someone in a fight." His voice went quiet. "And he's decided not to. Not because he can't, because he's seen enough." Clara stared at the table. Something was moving in her chest, slow and complicated. "He doesn't talk about it," Samuel said. "Doesn't think he owes anyone that explanation. And maybe he's right. But here, that silence gets mistaken." He looked up at her. "Sheriff Kane doesn't help matters." "Kane," Clara said. "I've seen him around. He was very—" She searched for the right word. "Friendly." "Kane is friendly to everyone until he isn't," Samuel said. "You watch that man's eyes when he smiles. Watch where the smile stops." He picked up his coffee cup. "He and Ethan have history. Kane started most of those rumors. Quiet Ethan this, useless Ethan that. He's been feeding it for years. Samuel looked at her steadily. Because Victor Kane is a man who needs to be the most capable person in any room. And Ethan Hale, without saying a single word, walks into rooms and makes that very difficult for Kane to be. She was thinking about that conversation 3 days later when it happened. She had driven herself in the small wagon out to the East Road to look at a section of fencing near her property line. And on the way back into town, the horse, young, barely 2 years in harness, that she hadn't thought to worry about, heard something in the dry brush at the side of the road. A coyote, maybe. A rattlesnake. Something. The horse lurched sideways so hard the wagon slewed, and Clara grabbed for the reins, but they were already pulled from her hands. And then the horse was running, and she was gripping the bench with both hands, and the wagon was bouncing and bucking over the rough road, and the reins were dragging in the dust, and she had no control. None at all. She was shouting. She didn't realize it until later, that she was making noise, calling out, because the town was ahead, barely visible, and someone needed to get out of the road. And then a figure stepped from the side of the road into the path directly ahead. Clara's heart seized. The horse saw him. The horse did not stop. It tried to go around, but the man spread his arms out wide and stepped left to cut it off. Not running, not diving, just moving steadily. And his voice came out, low and very calm, cutting straight through the noise and the heat and the dust. Easy, easy now, easy, girl. Not loud, not commanding, just present, absolute and steady. The horse slowed, stopped. It was heaving and trembling, and its eyes were wild, but it had stopped. The man had one hand on the bridle now, the other on the horse's neck, still speaking, still low. The horse dropped its head. Its sides shook. Then even that quieted. Clara sat on the bench of the stopped wagon and realized her hands were shaking and she was breathing too fast. She pressed her palms flat on her knees. The man turned and looked up at her. Ethan Hale. "You all right, ma'am?" he said. She was looking at his face, the same flat, controlled expression. He'd just stepped in front of a bolting horse without flinching, and he looked like he'd simply picked up something someone had dropped. "Yes," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I'm all right." He nodded. He handed the reins back up to her carefully, making sure she had them before he let go. His hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. "You shouldn't drive that horse alone yet," he said. "She's still green. Give her a few more months on a longer lead before you take her on roads with brush." "I'll remember that," Clara said. He started to step back. She said, "Ethan?" He stopped and looked up at her. She didn't know what she had been going to say. Something had come into her throat and sat there. She looked at him for a moment, standing in the dust of the road in the flat summer heat, completely untroubled. This quiet man who had just stepped in front of a runaway horse without being asked. And she felt something she had not felt in 8 months, maybe longer. She felt safe. "Thank you," she said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am?" He walked away. Clara sat in the stopped wagon with the reins in her hands and watched him go, and thought that the people of Red Ridge, Texas, had no idea what was standing in their midst. No idea at all. That evening, she sat on her porch as the heat finally began to break, the sky going orange and pink above the rooftops, and she thought about something Samuel Carter had said. He knows exactly what he could do, and he's decided not to. She thought about the 2 men in the street, the boot on his chest, the laughing. She thought about the fence posts in the morning quiet, the horse's leg, the traveling family who hadn't even known who to thank. She thought about his hands on the bridle. Steady, steady, steady. And she thought about Redridge, about the people who had watched him bleed in the street and done nothing, and then gone home and had their suppers and told themselves they knew what a weak man looked like. A sound came from somewhere down the road. Laughter from the saloon. Normal evening noise. The town settling into itself. Clara Whitmore sat on her porch in the summer dark of Redridge, Texas, and she thought, there is something deeply wrong with what this town thinks it knows. And she thought also, underneath that, quieter, more frightening to her, that she was very interested in finding out what was right. The next morning, Clara walked into the Silver Spur and asked for coffee. The room went a little quiet when she came in. Not completely, but enough. The kind of quiet that meant people were noticing something they hadn't decided how to feel about yet. A woman alone in a saloon before 9 in the morning was either very confident or very desperate. And Clara had decided a long time ago that she would always be mistaken for the first kind before the second. She sat at the counter, and the barkeep, a heavy-set man named Doyle with a gray mustache and careful eyes, poured her coffee without asking and said nothing, which she respected. She was halfway through the cup when Victor Kane walked in. She had seen him twice before, briefly. He was tall, clean-shaven, with a silver star on his chest, and the particular way of moving that men in positions of local authority often developed. Slow and deliberate, like the room was expected to arrange itself around him. He was handsome in a way that was probably more effective 10 years ago. His eyes were pale and very alert. He saw her immediately, and his face shifted into a wide, practiced smile. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, coming to the counter. "Settling in all right?" "Fine, thank you," Clara said. Kane took the stool 2 down from her and leaned one arm on the counter. "Heard you had some trouble out on the East Road yesterday." Clara looked at him. "Word travels fast." "Small town," he shrugged pleasantly. "Runaway horse is the kind of thing people mention." His voice stayed easy. "I heard Ethan Hale happened to be nearby." "He stopped the horse," Clara said. "It was fortunate." Kane accepted the coffee from Doyle and turned the cup in his hands. "You be careful around him, Mrs. Whitmore. I say that as someone whose job it is to know this town." Clara set her own cup down. "Is there a reason I should be careful around him?" Kane's expression stayed pleasant. That was what she noticed. The pleasantness never wavered, never cracked. It was the expression of a man who had practiced looking reasonable for a very long time. "He's not dangerous. I don't mean that exactly. He's just unpredictable. Men like that, quiet, keep to themselves, don't mix well. You never quite know what's going on in their heads." He paused. "I've seen him lose his temper once or twice. Not pretty." "What did he do?" Clara said. A slight hesitation, just slight. Nothing that ended up mattering, but the capacity was there, you understand me? A man who won't speak tends to build things up. Clara picked up her coffee cup. "That's very interesting, Sheriff, because the only person I've seen lose their temper in this town since I got here was a man named Deke Patterson, who had his boot on Ethan Hale's chest. And the only person who seemed unbothered by it was Ethan himself." Kane's smile stayed exactly where it was, but something shifted behind his eyes. Something quick and cold, gone before she could pin it down. "Like I said," he said pleasantly. "Unpredictable." He finished his coffee, set a coin on the counter, touched the brim of his hat to her, and walked out. Clara stared at the door after it closed. Then she looked at Doyle. Doyle was wiping down the counter with great focus and attention. A man wipes a counter when he heard something he doesn't want to have heard. "How long has Kane been sheriff here?" Clara said. Doyle kept wiping. "About 9 years. And Ethan Hale's been here 10. Doyle stopped wiping. He looked at her sideways, just briefly. Then he put the rag down and moved to the other end of the counter. And that was the end of that conversation. But it told her everything she needed. She went to find Samuel Carter. She found him at the south fence of his property, arguing with a fence post that wasn't going in straight. She took the other side of it without being asked and held it plumb while he drove it, and when it was done, he looked at her with something that might have been approval. "Kane talked to you," he said. It wasn't a question. "This morning." Clara brushed the dirt from her hands. "He warned me about Ethan." Samuel picked up his post-hole digger and moved to the next spot. "He does that with new people, especially women." He swung the digger into the ground. Women are better at listening, in Kane's experience, and more likely to repeat what they hear. "What does he have against Ethan?" Samuel worked for a moment before answering. "About 4 years ago, there was a situation with a ranching family south of town. The Morrow family. Parents, 3 kids. A man came through claiming rights to their land. Forged papers, but convincing enough for most people. Kane looked at the papers and said they were legitimate." He paused his digging. "Ethan didn't say a word publicly. He just rode to Abilene and back in 2 days. And when he came back, he had a lawyer with him. The papers were forgeries. The Morrows kept their land." Clara was quiet for a moment. Kane authenticated forged papers. "Negligence," he called it. "An honest mistake." Samuel's voice was dry as the August ground. Maybe it was. But Kane knew that Ethan had made him look like either a fool or something worse, in front of the whole town. And men like Kane don't forget that. He went back to digging. After that, the stories about Ethan got worse. Couldn't prove who was starting them, but they got worse. Clara thought about Kane's smooth, pleasant face, the smile that stopped exactly at his eyes. "Does anyone else know this?" "Some do," Samuel said. "But knowing a thing and saying it out loud, in a town where the sheriff controls who gets trouble and who doesn't, that's 2 different things." He looked at her directly. "You're not from here anymore, Mrs. Whitmore. You don't have the same reasons to stay quiet." She understood what he was telling her. She also understood that he was watching her carefully to see what she would do with it. "Neither do you," she said. Samuel Carter looked at her for a long moment. Then something moved across his old face, something that looked almost like relief. "No," he said. "I suppose I don't." He drove the next post in hard. Clara watched him and thought about what it cost a person to stay quiet about something they knew was wrong. She had done it herself. For years, in her own house, she had been very quiet about things she knew were wrong. And she had told herself it was wisdom, and it had taken her a long time to understand that it wasn't wisdom at all. It was just fear wearing a sensible dress. She wasn't going to make that mistake again. She went back to town and found Ethan at the livery. He was working on a saddle, seated on a low bench, and he looked up when she came in, but didn't stop what he was doing. That was something she had started to notice about him. He didn't perform surprise or welcome. He just acknowledged your presence and kept doing the thing he was already doing. It should have felt rude. It didn't. "I talked to Kane this morning," she said, coming to stand near the doorway. She didn't sit down. "He warned me about you." Ethan kept working the leather in his hands. "He does that." "He says you're unpredictable." "He means I'm inconvenient." Clara watched him work for a moment. "He told me you lost your temper, that it wasn't pretty." Ethan set the saddle piece down and looked at her. "What exactly are you doing, Mrs. Whitmore?" "Clara," she said, "and I'm finding out what's true." "Why?" The question was direct, and there was no performance in it. He wasn't being defensive. He genuinely wanted to know her reason. Clara found, to her faint surprise, that she had to think about it honestly before she answered. "Because I spent 6 years in a house where I pretended not to see things that were directly in front of me," she said. "I'm done doing that." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with those steady, dark eyes. "My temper," he said finally. "What Kane calls losing it. I raised my voice once. At Kane himself, in the middle of the street, 2 years ago, when he told the Hendersons their well had to be blocked because it was on disputed land, and he knew full well it wasn't." He paused. "I said his name loud enough for people to hear, and I told him he was wrong, and I told him why. That's what he calls losing my temper." "Because you raised your voice?" "Because I did it where other people could hear." The livery was hot and still. Outside, the town was going about its morning, completely indifferent to this conversation happening in the shade. Clara thought about what that cost. Not the raising of his voice, but the silence before and after. Year after year of knowing something was wrong and choosing, every day, not to become what that wrongness wanted you to become. "How do you do it?" she said. "All of it. The things they say about you. The things they do. How do you just keep living here like it doesn't matter?" Ethan picked up the saddle piece again. His hands moved. "It matters," he said. "I'm not pretending it doesn't matter." He worked a moment. "But a man can't build anything on other people's opinions of him. Can't build a fence with it. Can't keep a horse calm with it. Can't do one useful thing with it." He didn't look up. "So I put it somewhere, and I do the work. That's all." Clara stood in the doorway of the livery in the morning heat and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not pity. She didn't think Ethan Hale would know what to do with pity, and she wasn't offering it. It was something closer to recognition. The recognition of someone who had also learned to put things somewhere and keep moving. She left him to his work. But she came back the next day, and the one after that. It started small, the way most real things start. She began stopping at the livery when she passed. Not for any particular reason, just to exchange a sentence or two. He never seemed surprised to see her, and he never seemed to be waiting for her, which she found she liked. She learned quickly that he talked in short stretches, never more than he needed, but never less either. He didn't fill silence with noise, which meant that the things he did say had weight. She had spent 6 years in a house full of noise that meant nothing, and she had forgotten what it felt like when words had weight. She found out, in pieces, over those days. He had grown up in Ohio. He had joined the Army at 19. He had come to Redridge because Samuel Carter had been a friend of his commanding officer, and had written offering work, and because Ethan had needed to be somewhere quiet after the territories, and Redridge had seemed quiet enough. He had not expected it to be so complicated. She told him, in pieces, smaller pieces, that she had grown up here and left at 22 to marry Robert Whitmore, who was charming and well-liked and had hit her exactly twice, which was 2 times more than she had ever told anyone, and twice less than she had feared before she left. She said that last part simply and without drama, because she had decided a long time ago that the things that happened to her were facts, not secrets, and she was tired of carrying facts like secrets. Ethan heard that and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry that happened." "I know," she said. "You don't have to explain it." "I know that too," she said. "I wanted to." He nodded. Something shifted in his face. that brief softening she had started to learn to look for under all the steadiness. Then, but she had seen it. And that was when Deke Patterson walked into the livery. Patterson was the red-faced man from the street. He was with two others she didn't know, and they had the afternoon swagger of men who had already been drinking and were looking for somewhere to put the excess of themselves. He stopped when he saw Clara. Then he looked at Ethan and grinned. "Well," he said, "Quiet Ethan found himself a widow to talk to."
Ethan didn't look up from his work. "She know about you?" Patterson said to Clara directly. "What he is? What he ain't?"
"I know more about him than you do," Clara said. Her voice came out flat and sure. Patterson blinked. He hadn't expected that. The two men behind him shifted. "That's so," Patterson said. Not a question. A slow, dangerous smile. "Widow Whitmore's taken a shine to the town's sorriest excuse for a Deke." Ethan's voice came out quiet and very level, and he still hadn't looked up. "You're going to want to stop there." Patterson stopped. Not because he was afraid. Clara could see that. He stopped because something in Ethan's voice was different. Not loud, not angry, just final. The way a door sounds when it closes for the last time. Patterson held the pause for a moment, testing it. Then he laughed, brittle. "Big talk," he said, "from a man who lays in the dirt." Ethan set down his work. He looked up at Patterson. He stood. He did not advance. He did not raise a hand. He just stood up to his full height and looked at Patterson with an expression that was perfectly still and absolutely clear. And something moved through the livery that had no name. Just temperature, just pressure, just the sudden absolute certainty that Patterson was looking at something he did not understand and had deeply miscalculated. Patterson took one step back. He didn't seem to know he'd done it. "Get out," Ethan said, quietly. Patterson looked at Clara, then back at Ethan. Then he turned and walked out, his two companions close behind him. No more words, no more grimming. Just gone. The livery was silent. Clara looked at Ethan. He sat back down and picked up his work and said nothing. "He didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." "But you did." He worked the leather in his hands. "Some things need to be clear." Clara understood, with a certainty that settled into her like something solid, that he hadn't stood up for himself. He had stood up for her, and the difference mattered. It mattered enormously, because a man who knew that difference was a man who understood something that most men never learned. She sat down on the bench across from him, and neither of them spoke for a while. And the afternoon moved around them, and it was the most at ease Clara Whitmore had felt in longer than she could measure. That ease lasted exactly 4 days. 4 days before Victor came to her door in the evening, hat in hand, pleasant smile perfectly in place, and said he had heard she had been spending a good deal of time at the livery, and he wanted to make sure she understood the situation fully, and he had some things to tell her about Ethan Hale's past that she might find relevant, and he thought she deserved to know the truth. He said the word truth with such smooth conviction that Clara almost believed, for a half second, that he was the kind of man who dealt in it. Almost. She looked at Victor Kane standing in her doorway in the summer evening, with his careful eyes and his careful smile and his 9 years of shaping what this town believed and who it trusted, and she understood, clearly and completely, that the real threat in Redridge had never been the quiet man at the livery. It had been standing on her porch the whole time, wearing a silver star. Clara did not let Kane inside. She stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame and listened to him talk for about 2 minutes before she said, very calmly, "Sheriff, I appreciate you coming by, but I think I've heard enough." Kane's smile didn't move. "Mrs. Whitmore, I just want to make sure you have the full picture." "I have a picture," Clara said. "I'm not sure it's the one you're trying to give me." Something passed through his eyes, quick and cold, the same thing she had seen in the saloon. Then the smile adjusted, just slightly, and he touched the brim of his hat. "Well, my door is always open if you change your mind. I know where to find you," Clara said. She closed the door before he turned to leave. She stood with her back against it in the dark of her own hallway and let out a long, slow breath. Her hands were steady. She was glad her hands were steady. She went to Samuel Carter the next morning and told him what had happened. Samuel listened without interrupting, which was something she valued about him. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "He's moving faster than usual." "What does that mean?" "It means he's worried." Samuel looked at his hands. "Kane works slow, normally. Drip by drip. That's how he's operated for 9 years. Never one big push, just steady, quiet pressure. A word here and a word there. And before people know it, they believe what he wants them to believe." He paused. "When he starts moving fast, it means something changed. Something he didn't plan on." Clara thought about that. "He saw me talking to Ethan." "He saw you not listening to what the town says about Ethan," Samuel corrected. "That's different, and more dangerous to him." He looked at her steadily. "Clara, I need to tell you something. There is a man coming to Redridge in about 2 weeks. A land assessor from Austin. He's here to review property boundaries on the South Quarter, including the Morrow land." Clara went very still. "Kane authenticated those forged papers 4 years ago," Samuel said. "If this assessor digs into the original survey records and talks to the right people—" He stopped. "Kane has been working to make sure Ethan isn't credible enough to be listened to if he talks. That's what the last 4 years have been. It's not personal hatred, Clara. It's calculation." The room went quiet, except for the sound of the summer outside. "We have to tell Ethan," Clara said. "He knows," Samuel said simply. "He's known for a while. That's not what worries me." He looked at her directly. "What worries me is that Kane knows Ethan knows, and a man who is cornered will do things he wouldn't otherwise do." Clara left Samuel's ranch with that sentence sitting in her chest like a stone, and she went straight to the livery. Ethan wasn't there. Doyle at the saloon told her he'd ridden out to the south fence line early that morning. She didn't ask why. She went back to her house, and she told herself it was fine. She would speak to him tomorrow, and she sat down to eat supper and could not eat, and stood up and paced and sat down again. At 9 o'clock that night, 3 things happened almost simultaneously. She heard shouting from the direction of the main street, then a gunshot, then the bell of the church started ringing. Not the slow Sunday rhythm, but fast and hard and continuous, the sound that meant one thing and one thing only in every small town in Texas in 1874. Danger. Clara was out of her door before the bell rang 3 times. The main street of Redridge was chaos. She understood that much in the first 10 seconds. People running in wrong directions, a horse rearing outside the bank, the sound of more shouting from inside the building itself. A woman she didn't know was pressing herself against the wall of the general store with both hands over her mouth. A man ran past Clara without seeing her. "What's happening?" Clara grabbed his arm. He pulled free without stopping. "Bank," he said. "Riders. 6, maybe more." He was gone. She looked toward the bank. The door was hanging open. A lamp had been knocked over somewhere inside, and the light was wrong, flickering, and she could hear voices. Rough, hard voices, not from Redridge. She looked for Kane. She looked for the Silver Star anywhere on that street. She did not see it. What she saw instead was a young deputy, barely 20, she thought, white-faced and shaking, standing in the middle of the road with his hand on his holster and not drawing,
Because there were two men on horseback between him and the bank, and the horses were big, and the men on them were bigger. One of the the deputy and laughed. "Put your hand down, boy," he said. "There ain't enough of you." The deputy's hand stayed on the holster. His whole arm was shaking. Clara walked to the doorway of the nearest building, the dress shop, and pressed herself inside the frame, and watched and thought very fast about what she knew and what she didn't, and where Cain was. Where Cain was. The thought was cold and specific. 6 armed men did not ride into a town without knowing something about that town first, without knowing who would stop them and who wouldn't, without knowing where the sheriff was and what he would do.
She was still thinking it when a figure appeared at the far end of the street, on foot, moving without hurrying. She knew the shape of him before she could make out the face, the particular way he moved, unhurried, deliberate, as if the noise and the chaos and the 2 men on horseback in the middle of Red Ridge's main street were simply a situation to be assessed and then handled. Ethan Hale walked into the middle of that street and stopped. The 2 horsemen turned. "Well, well," the one who had laughed said. He was a big man, heavy in the shoulders, with a red bandana and small, mean eyes. Red Ridge did have something left. "Let the boy go," Ethan said. His voice carried clean and flat in the night air. The horseman tilted his head. "You serious?" "The boy and everyone else on this street. Let them clear." The other horseman shifted his horse sideways. His hand was near his gun. "How about instead we just make this real simple and put you in the dirt?" Ethan looked at him. "You could try that." Something in the way he said it stopped both men for a half-second. Clara felt it from 40 feet away. A change in the air, a sudden uncertainty in the 2 men on horseback that hadn't been there a moment ago. They were looking at Ethan the way people looked at something when they suddenly weren't sure what it was. The deputy took that half-second and ran. Clara saw him go, stumbling sideways off the street. A few of the watching townspeople scattered after him. Good. That was good. Then the doors of the bank burst open, and 4 more men came out, and 2 of them were dragging someone. And that someone was a woman. Clara recognized her as Helen Marsh, wife of the bank manager, who came to church every Sunday and always sat in the 3rd pew. And Helen Marsh was not making noise, because one of the men had his arm across her throat. Everything in Clara's chest went tight. The big horseman grinned. "There it is," he said to Ethan. "How serious are you now, Cowboy?" Ethan didn't move. His eyes went to Helen Marsh, came back to the man holding her, calculated something Clara couldn't see, and went still. "Let her go," he said. "Whatever you got out of that bank, take it. Right out. Nobody here is going to stop you." "No?" The man holding Helen Marsh looked around the empty street and laughed. "I believe you're right about that. Seems like Red Ridge ain't got much fight in it tonight." His eyes came back to Ethan and narrowed. "Except maybe you." "Let her go," Ethan said again. Identical tone, identical patience, like he had all night. "I don't think so." The man jerked his head at the 2 horsemen. "Put him down." The first horseman drew. What happened next took less than 4 seconds, and Clara saw all of it and could not afterward have explained exactly how she saw it, because it was too fast and too precise to be something a person could process in real time. She would only understand it later, pieced together from what her eyes had caught and held. Ethan moved left. 1 step, just enough, and the shot went past him and into the wooden post of the trader's awning. In the same movement, his right hand closed on the horseman's wrist and pulled, hard and sharp, in the direction the horse was already moving, and the man came off the horse and hit the street and did not get up. The second horseman swung his gun around and Ethan was already not where he had been. 2 steps forward, inside the range of the gun. One hand on the barrel, pushing it skyward as it fired. The sound enormous and immediate. And then a single precise strike to the side of the man's head, and the second horseman folded off his saddle. 3 seconds. 2 men down. The 4 men in front of the bank had gone completely still. Helen Marsh was making a high, tight sound behind the arm at her throat. The man holding her had not moved. He was staring at Ethan with an expression that was no longer the loose, confident cruelty of a man who expected no opposition. His eyes had gone careful and calculating and frightened. Ethan stood in the middle of the street. Both guns lay in the dirt. His breathing was even. His hands were loose at his sides. He looked at the man holding Helen Marsh. "Last time," he said. "Let her go." The man's arm tightened for 1 second, one terrible, held second, and Clara's heart stopped entirely. Then the man released Helen Marsh and shoved her forward, and she stumbled toward the street, and a woman came running from somewhere and caught her. The 4 men looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back. "Ride," he said. They rode. The sound of hooves on hard dirt road faded into the dark, and the August night settled back over Redridge like it had never been broken, and the street was suddenly very quiet. Clara came out of the doorway of the dress shop. She was walking toward Ethan before she fully decided to. He was still standing where he'd been. Both horses had spooked and moved off. The 2 men in the dirt were starting to stir and groan, and he had his back to her, watching the direction the riders had gone, making sure. She stopped a few feet behind him. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Are you hurt?" He turned. He looked at her for a moment, checking her with the same quick assessment he'd probably been trained to give any person in a situation like this. "No," he said. "You?" "No." She looked at his hands, loose and calm. "Ethan, you—" "Is Helen all right?" he said. Clara looked back. Helen Marsh was sitting on the boardwalk in front of the hardware store, with the other woman's arm around her, her head down, alive and breathing. "She's all right," Clara said. Ethan nodded. He started to turn away, toward the 2 men on the ground, she thought, to check them, to do the next necessary thing. And Clara said, "Stop." He stopped. "Don't just walk away," she said. "Don't do that right now." He turned back and looked at her. His face was the same controlled, still thing it always was. But his eyes, in the unsteady light from the damaged lamp inside the bank, his eyes were something else. She saw it. The thing underneath the control. Not wildness, not pride. Something quieter and much more honest than either of those. The exhaustion of a man who had spent 10 years carrying something that nobody around him could see, and the very particular loneliness of being completely misunderstood by everyone in a town you'd chosen to call home. She saw it, and she held it. Then she said, "Where is Kane?" The exhaustion went somewhere else in his face, and what replaced it was something flat and certain. "I think you already know the answer to that," he said. She did. She had known since she'd scanned that street and found no silver star anywhere in the chaos. She had known since Samuel Carter had said, "A man who is cornered will do things he wouldn't otherwise do." She had known, really, since that first morning in the Silver Spur, when she had looked at Kane's careful, pleasant face, and understood that a man who never cracked his pleasantness wasn't being nice. He was being guarded. "He told them when to come," Clara said. "He told them the combination," Ethan said. "The bank changed it 3 months ago. Nobody outside this town knew the new one." He paused. "Except Kane."
A sound came from across the street. The deputy had come back, braver now that the horses were gone, and behind him were 4 or 5 men from the town, coming out of wherever when it started. They were walking toward Ethan with the specific, tentative energy of people who had witnessed something they needed to rearrange their understanding around. Old Tom Hadley was among them, the man whose fence Ethan had fixed in the early morning without being asked. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Ethan, and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I seen that before, that kind of fighting. Up in the territories, during the war." He paused. "Where'd you serve, son?" Ethan looked at him. "Frontier Scout, 6th Cavalry, 6 years." Hadley was quiet for a moment. Then he took off his hat. It was a small gesture, almost nothing. But in that particular moment, on that particular street, in the way he held it against his chest and looked at Ethan Hale, it was not nothing at all. "I'm sorry," Hadley said, "for what this town's done." Ethan looked at him. Then he nodded once, short and direct, the way he did everything. More people were coming out of buildings now. More people were looking. The street was refilling, and every person on it had just watched the man they'd called weak and useless and worth nothing take down 2 armed riders in under 4 seconds, without a gun, and walk away unhurt, and then stand there and refuse to leave until the rest of them let a woman go free. Clara watched their faces, watched the rearrangement happening behind their eyes, watched the slow, uncomfortable work of people realizing that they had been wrong, specifically and significantly wrong, for a very long time. She turned to look for Kane. She found him. He was at the far end of the street, coming from the direction of his office, unhurried, composed, silver star catching the light. And even from this distance, Clara could see the calculation happening in his face as he assessed what had occurred and began to decide how to manage it. He was going to try to manage it. She understood that immediately. He was going to walk up here with that smooth, practiced authority and find a way to put himself at the center of what just happened and make Ethan something other than what he was. He had done it before. He had done it for 9 years, and it had worked, more or less, because there hadn't been enough people watching closely enough to push back. Clara looked at Ethan. He had seen Kane too. His jaw was set, and his eyes were steady, and he was doing what he always did, holding still, holding back, letting the world do what the world was going to do. She took a step forward. "No," Ethan said quietly behind her. "Yes," she said, equally quiet. And then she kept walking. Because Victor Kane was about to walk into a crowd of people who had just seen the truth with their own eyes. And for the first time in 9 years, there was someone in Redridge willing to say out loud what that truth was. Clara Whitmore walked toward him, through the middle of the street, and she did not stop. Kane saw her coming, and his smile appeared right on schedule. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "thank God you're all right. I just heard—" "Where were you?" Clara said. She said it loudly, loudly enough that the people behind her could hear it. She had chosen that volume deliberately, and she did not apologize for it. Kane's smile adjusted, just slightly. "I was dealing with a situation at the south end of town. Someone reported a fire near the Hendersons' barn. Turned out to be nothing, but by the time I—" "Who reported it?" Clara said. Kane blinked. "Excuse me?" "Who reported the fire? Give me a name." A pause. The kind of pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. "I'd have to check my notes," Kane said pleasantly. "You'd have to check your notes," Clara repeated.
She turned slightly so that her voice carried back to the people gathered behind her. The sheriff of Redridge would have to check his notes to remember who sent him away from town. On the same night, 6 armed men rode in and robbed the bank. The street was very quiet. Kane's face did something she hadn't seen it do before. The pleasantness didn't disappear. It was too practiced for that. But it thinned, like paint on old wood, showing the grain underneath. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you've had a frightening evening." "I've had an informative evening," Clara said. "And I'd like to ask you something directly, Sheriff, in front of these people. In front of everyone who just watched Ethan Hale stop 6 armed men while you were gone." She held his gaze. "The Morrow land papers. 4 years ago. Did you know they were forgeries when you authenticated them?" The sound that came from the crowd behind her was low and collective. Not loud, just a shift, a held breath, a movement. The sound of people who had just understood that this conversation was not going in any direction they had expected. Kane looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Fast, calculating, deciding. Then the pleasantness came back, thicker this time, performed. "I'm not going to stand in the street and answer accusations from a widow who's been in this town for 3 weeks, he said. His voice had dropped the warmth and found something harder underneath. "You've been spending time with Ethan Hale, and he's filled your head with—" "I filled my own head," Clara said. "That's something you should account for." "Clara," Ethan's voice came from directly behind her. She hadn't heard him follow her, and she turned, startled. He was standing 2 feet back, looking not at her, but at Kane. His expression was the same controlled thing it always was. But there was something different in the set of his jaw tonight. Not anger. She had come to understand that Ethan Hale's anger didn't look like other people's anger. It looked like stillness, like a door that had closed and locked and was not going to open again. "You don't need to do this," he said to her, quiet enough that Kane couldn't hear. "Someone does," she said. "Not tonight," he said. "Not like this." She looked at him for a moment. The cut on his left hand from the street fight, the dust on his shirt, the steadiness of him in all of it, and understood that he wasn't asking her to stop for his sake. He was asking her to stop for hers. Because he had been watching Kane operate for 10 years, and he knew how a man like Kane responded when he was cornered in public. He knew it got worse before it got better, and he did not want Clara in the middle of worse. She took a breath. Then she stepped back. Kane looked between them with something that wasn't quite a smile. "Wise," he said. "Don't," Ethan said. One word. Flat and final. Kane looked at him, and for the first time in the 10 years Ethan had lived in Redridge, Texas, Victor Kane looked at Ethan Hale without the protective pleasure of a man who held all the cards. He looked at him the way a man looks at something he realizes he is misjudged. And underneath the calculation and the management and the 9 years of careful, drip-by-drip work, underneath all of it, was something that looked very much like fear. He touched his hat brim to the crowd and walked away. The people of Redridge watched him go in silence. Then Tom Hadley said, to no one in particular, "We need a new sheriff." And 3 people said yes before he finished the sentence. The night unwound slowly after that. The 2 men Ethan had pulled from their horses were tied and held for the deputy. The bank manager came out shaking and confirmed that the only people who had known the new combination were himself, his wife, and Kane. The deputy, whose name was Will Garrett, wrote everything down with the focused intensity of a young man who had just discovered his own courage and was not going to waste it. Clara sat on the steps of the church while all of this happened, and Ethan sat beside her, and neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, she said, "He's going to run." "Probably." "Tonight, maybe?"
Maybe.
Does that bother you? She said. Ethan was quiet for a moment.
It bothers me less than it should, he said. I'm tired, Clara. I've been tired of this for a long time. She looked at him. It was the most thing he had said to her. Not the most words. He had said more words on various occasions, but the most exposed. The tiredness in his voice was real and specific, and she recognized it because she had carried her own version of it for years. The tiredness of holding yourself steady in a situation that kept requiring more steadiness than any person should have to provide.
You could have left, she said. Any time in the last 10 years. You could have just left.
I could have, he said.
Why didn't you?
He looked at his hands for a moment. Samuel, he said. He gave me work when I needed it. He never asked me to be anything other than what I was. He paused. And I don't leave things I've started. She thought about that. About a man who had stayed in a town that misunderstood him and diminished him and let him bleed in the street. Stayed because he had given his word to a 73-year-old man, and because he didn't leave things unfinished. She thought about what that said about the architecture of a person's character. Samuel told me about the 6th Cavalry, she said. The territories. Ethan didn't respond to that right away. She had learned to let his silences sit. Samuel talks more than he thinks he does, he said finally. He loves you, Clara said simply. Something shifted in Ethan's face, not the brief softening she had learned to look for. Something bigger, and gone, faster, like he hadn't meant for it to surface. I know, he said quietly. The church bell was silent now. The street was thinning. Redridge was doing what small towns did after something large, pulling back into its houses, its kitchens, its private conversations, beginning the long process of deciding what had happened and what it meant. Clara and Ethan sat on the church steps in the August dark, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind. She had stopped expecting those. After Robert, she had stopped believing that silence with another person could be restful. She had learned to associate it with tension, with things unsaid, and doors that were dangerous to open. This was not that kind of silence. She became aware, sitting there, that her shoulder was nearly touching his, that she had moved, at some point without noticing, to within a few inches of him. She did not move away. He did not move away either.
What are you going to do now? She said.
Same as before, he said. Work Samuel's ranch. Fix things that need fixing.
And Kane?
Will Garrett's a good deputy, Ethan said. Better than Kane ever was. The town knows what it needs to know now. The rest will work itself out. Clara turned to look at him. His profile in the dark was steady and certain, and she thought about what it took to have that kind of faith in a process. To do the right thing, year after year, in a place that punished you for it, and still believe that it would work itself out. That wasn't naivety. She could see clearly enough by now that Ethan Hale was not a naive man. It was something harder to come by, and much more deliberate. You know what the worst part is? She said. He looked at her. None of this had to happen. All of it. The rumors, the street, all of it. It didn't have to happen. If one person had just been paying attention, if one person had just said out loud what they could see. People see what they're told to see, Ethan said. Not always, Clara said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, No, not always. The distance between them was very small. She was aware of it in a way that was new, and also not new at all. Not new in the sense that she had been aware of him for weeks, had been aware of the space between them every time they had talked, had always been aware of when it narrowed and when it opened.
but new in the sense that she was not pretending not to be aware of it anymore. She had used up all her pretending. She said, "I'm not leaving Redridge." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't think you were." "I'm saying it out loud," she said, "because I think things should be said out loud." Something in his expression moved, not the small, soft shift she was used to, something larger and more direct. He looked at her the way he had looked at things in the street earlier, that complete, focused assessment. Except that this was not assessment. This was recognition. "Clara," he said. "Don't tell me it's complicated," she said. "I know it's complicated." "I wasn't going to say that." "What were you going to say?" He was quiet for a moment. "That I'm glad you didn't leave after the first day," he said. "When you should have, probably. When most people would have." She felt something move through her chest, deep and warm. "I'm very bad at leaving when I should," she said. "I noticed," he said. And that small, real smile appeared. The one she had first seen in the doorway of the general store. The one that transformed his whole face briefly into something completely unguarded. And Clara thought that she would remember this moment for the rest of her life. Not the drama of the evening, not Kane or the gunshots or the street. This exact moment on the church steps in the August dark, with that smile. She reached over and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, and he did not say anything, and she did not say anything. And they sat there, while Redridge quieted around them. That was the beginning of what happened next. Kane was gone by morning. He left sometime in the night, his horse missing from the stable, his office desk cleared of personal items, his house unlocked and abandoned. He left so cleanly it was almost impressive, the practiced exit of a man who had always kept one bag half-packed. Will Garrett found a locked box in the desk drawer that he could not open until Samuel Carter's lawyer came from Abilene 4 days later. And when they opened it, there were documents inside that made several things very clear. The forged Morrow papers with Kane's own annotations, a ledger of payments, names. The town of Redridge read those names and was very quiet for several days. Ethan did not say anything about the documents when the story circulated. He went to work at Samuel's ranch, as he had every day for 10 years. He fixed the things that needed fixing. He did not say, "I told you so," which Clara thought was either the most disciplined or the most generous thing she had ever watched a person do, and she suspected it was both. People started coming to him. Not all at once, not with any announcement or ceremony, just one by one, in the quiet way that genuine contrition usually moves. Slowly, and at close range, and with less eloquence than the situation probably deserved. Deke Patterson came to the livery on a Thursday morning. Clara was there when he came in, and she watched him stand in the doorway with his hat in his hands and look at Ethan, who was working at the bench and had not looked up. "I owe you an apology," Patterson said. His voice was stiff with the effort of it. "More than one, probably." Ethan set his work down. He looked at Patterson for a moment. "All right," he said. Patterson blinked. I want to say—" "Deke." Ethan's voice was level and without malice. "You said it. I heard it. We can move on." Patterson stood there for another moment, clearly having prepared for a conversation that was now not going to happen. Then something shifted in his face. The stiffness went out of it, and something simpler replaced it. Something almost like relief. "Yeah," he said. "All right then." He put his hat back on and left. Clara looked at Ethan. "You made that very easy for him." "Hard doesn't fix anything," Ethan said, and went back to his work. She thought about that for days afterward. The economy of it. The complete absence of the kind of performance that most people needed from reconciliation. The prolonged discomfort of the person apologizing. The acknowledgement of injury. The visible suffering of the person who had done wrong. Ethan wanted none of it.
Because the wrongs hadn't mattered. She knew they had. But because holding someone in that discomfort didn't rebuild anything. And Ethan Hale was at his foundation, a builder. She told him that one evening. They were on her porch after supper, which had become a pattern over the past 2 weeks. Supper at her house, sometimes cooked by her, and sometimes, surprisingly, by him. And then the porch, and the dark, and the kind of conversation that moved wherever it wanted. A builder, he repeated, the almost smile. That's a generous word for a ranch hand. Stop that, Clara said. He looked at her. Stop what? Reducing yourself. She met his eyes directly. You do it sometimes. When someone says something true about you, you make it smaller. I've noticed. He was quiet for a moment. Force of habit, he said finally. I know, she said. 10 years of being told you're nothing will do that. She paused. But I'm telling you something different, and I need you to hear it without making it smaller. He looked at her for a long time. Something in his face was very still. The deepest kind of still. The kind that meant something important was being held steady. All right, he said quietly. You are the most capable person in this town, she said. Not because of what happened in the street last week. Because of every day before that. Because of the fence posts, and the horse's leg, and the way you talked to Samuel, and the way you forgave Deke Patterson in 10 seconds, and the way you stayed in a place that didn't deserve you for 10 years because you had given your word. She held his gaze. That is not nothing. That is not almost something. That is the whole thing. The porch was quiet. The night sounds of Redridge moved around them and meant nothing. Ethan Hale looked at Clara Whitmore and the control in his face. The 10 years of held back, held together, held steady, shifted completely. Not breaking, not falling apart, just opening. The way a door opens when the person on the other side finally arrives. Clara, he said. His voice was different, lower, the steadiness still there, but stripped of armor. I know, she said softly. I know. He reached out and she met him halfway, and when his arms came around her, it was not the tentative embrace of a man unsure of his welcome. It was the embrace of a man who had been carrying something alone for a very long time, and had finally found someone strong enough to carry it alongside him. She pressed her face against his shoulder and felt his heart beating. Fast, she was surprised to find. Fast and human and real. And she thought about the distance she had traveled to get here. Not just from Abilene, not just the 11 hours in the stagecoach. From 6 years of a marriage built on performance and silence. From a lifetime of being told that love was about finding someone the world admired and holding on. From every version of herself that had been quiet when she should have spoken. She had come back to Redridge to stand still. She had found, instead, the one person in it who understood that standing still and standing firm were entirely different things. Samuel Carter heard about it from Doyle at the saloon, who heard it from the pastor, who had seen them on the porch from across the road. Samuel put down his coffee cup and looked out his window for a long moment. Then he smiled, small, private. The smile of a man who had been waiting patiently for something to finally go right. About time, he said, to no one in particular. And in Red Ridge, Texas, in the deep heat of August 1874, things began. Slowly, imperfectly, and with all the difficulty that real things require.
to change. The proposal happened on a Tuesday, which was not a romantic day by anyone's measure. And that was exactly why Clara remembered it so precisely. She was in the middle of repairing the kitchen pump, the one that had been stiff since she arrived, that she had been meaning to fix properly for weeks and kept putting off. And her hands were dirty, and her hair was coming loose from its pins, and she was using language that would have genuinely disturbed the ladies of the Red Ridge Church Auxiliary when she heard boots on the porch steps. Ethan came through the door, took one look at her situation, and without a word crouched down beside her and took the wrench from her hand and did the thing she'd been trying to do for 20 minutes in about 45 seconds. He stood back up and handed the wrench back. She looked at him. "I had that." "You did," he agreed. "I was almost there." "You were," he said, "but I was faster." She narrowed her eyes at him, and he looked back at her with that expression, the one that was perfectly level except for the very corners of his mouth. And she thought, not for the first time, that it was deeply unfair how much she liked him. He said, "Marry me." Clara stared at him. "I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks," he said. "I thought about a better way to ask. Couldn't find one." He paused. "You told me things should be said out loud, so I'm saying it." She was still staring at him. Her hands were dirty, and the kitchen smelled like pipe rust, and the pump was dripping behind them. And Ethan Hale was looking at her, with the same direct, quiet certainty with which he looked at everything. Like the answer mattered, but the asking was the part he was responsible for. And he had done the part he was responsible for, and the rest was hers. "You couldn't find a better way," she repeated. "No." "No flowers?" "No, you couldn't have waited until supper at least." "I thought about that," he said. "But you were here, and I was here, and I've been carrying it for 3 weeks, Clara. It seemed like a waste to wait until supper." She looked at him for a long moment, at the steadiness of his face and the realness of his eyes and the calluses on his hands from 10 years of work that nobody had thanked him for until recently, at the man who had stayed when leaving would have been easier, who had been quiet when silence cost him everything, who had fixed a pump in 45 seconds and then asked her to marry him in 11 words. "Yes," she said. The word landed between them, simple and complete. He took her dirty hands in his and held them, and looked at her for a moment with that open expression, the one without armor, and said nothing, which was exactly right. They told Samuel that evening. The old man sat very still for a moment when they told him, and then he got up from his chair, slowly and with some difficulty, and he shook Ethan's hand and held it for a long moment, and then he turned to Clara and said, "Your father would have liked him." Clara blinked hard. "Yes," she said, "he would have." Samuel patted her hand. Then he went to the shelf where he kept a bottle of good whiskey for occasions that deserved it, and he poured 3 glasses, and they sat at his table in the evening and drank, and nobody said much, and it was one of the finest hours Clara Whitmore had ever spent. The news moved through Red Ridge the way news moved through small towns. Before either of them had told a second person, half the town seemed to know. Clara walked to the general store the next morning, and Doyle said, "Congratulations," before she opened her mouth, and Mrs. Ida Pratt stopped her on the boardwalk and took her hands and looked at her with an expression that was partially genuine warmth and partially the specific satisfaction of a woman who had expected to disapprove of something and found, to her own surprise, that she couldn't. "He's a good man," Ida said, with the air of someone correcting the record. "I want you to know I always thought so." Clara looked at her. "Did you?" Ida had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. "I may have repeated things I shouldn't have, early on." A pause. "I was wrong, too." "Yes," Clara said, not unkindly. "You were." Ida squeezed her hands once, tightly, and let go.
Be happy, she said, and walked away. Clara stood on the boardwalk in the August morning and thought about that. About the particular work of a small town reckoning with itself. Not dramatic, not announced, just one person at a time saying, I was wrong, and meaning it, and being held to it. Slow work, and imperfect, and sometimes it felt like not enough. But it was happening. That was not nothing. The wedding was set for 3 weeks out. In those 3 weeks, Redridge did 2 things that surprised Clara. The first was that Will Garrett was formally appointed acting sheriff with the unanimous support of the town council, which was the right decision and had been obvious for some time, and she was glad they'd finally made it. The second thing surprised her more. The women of the church auxiliary, led, unlikely as it was, by Helen Marsh, who had not forgotten who had stood in the middle of the street and refused to leave until she was safe, organized a gathering at the church hall and invited every woman in Redridge. Clara came because Helen personally asked her, and she liked Helen and respected what she had been through. She walked in to find 15 women sitting in a circle of chairs and a table with coffee and pie. And the conversation she walked into was direct and specific, and about a year overdue. It was about what they had let happen. To Ethan, yes, but more broadly. About the pattern of listening to rumor over observation. About the convenience of believing what the person in authority told them to believe. About how many of them had seen, privately, the same things Clara had seen. The fence posts, the horses, the quiet, consistent presence of a man doing right by people who gave him nothing in return, and had kept that observation to themselves because it was easier. Helen Marsh said, in a voice that was still slightly rough from the grip on her throat, "He stepped into the street for us, with no gun and no obligation, and we had let them call him nothing for 10 years. She paused. That's on us. Not just Kane. Us. The room was very quiet. Then one woman said, "Yes," and another, and another. Clara didn't say anything. She sat in the circle and listened and felt something tighten and release in her chest. The complicated feeling of watching people choose, collectively, to be better than they had been. It was not comfortable. It was not quick. But it was real. She told Ethan about it that evening. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. Helen organized that? Helen led it, Clara said. She was remarkable. He nodded slowly. Something moved in his face that she had learned to read by now. That specific quietness that meant he was feeling something more than he was going to say. She doesn't owe me that, he said. No, Clara said. She did it because she wanted to. Because it was right. She looked at him directly. You're going to have to get more comfortable with people doing right by you, Ethan. It's going to keep happening. He looked at her. Is that a warning? It's a fact, she said. You should prepare yourself. That small, real smile appeared. She still felt it every time, like a hand pressed briefly against her sternum. I'll work on it, he said. 3 days before the wedding, a rider came into Redridge from the direction of Abilene with a letter addressed to Samuel Carter. Samuel read it at his kitchen table, and then sat for a long time with the letter in his hands before he sent for Ethan. Ethan came and read the letter, and handed it back without a word. Samuel watched him. It changes things, Samuel said. It doesn't change anything, Ethan said. Ethan, Samuel. His voice was quiet and final. It doesn't change anything. Clara found out about the letter that evening when she arrived for supper and found both men at the table with the specific, careful silence of people who had just finished a disagreement. She looked between them. What happened? She said.
Samuel looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at his coffee cup for a moment. Then he looked at Clara and said, "The 6th Cavalry sent a letter. There's a commendation from the War Department for actions in the territories 7 years ago." He paused. "They want to make a formal presentation. They want to come here, to Redridge, and do it publicly." Clara stared at him. "Ethan, that's—" "I wrote back and said no," he said. The kitchen went quiet. "You said no," Clara said carefully. "I don't need it," he said. "What happened in the territories, I did what needed to be done. Men survived who shouldn't have. That's the end of it. I don't need a ceremony." He looked at her steadily. "I know you're going to argue with me." "I'm not going to argue," she said. "I'm going to ask you one question." He waited. "Is this about not needing it?" Clara said. "Or about not believing you deserve it?" The silence that followed was the longest one he had given her. She held it. Samuel held it. The evening held it. Ethan looked at his hands, then up at her. Then he exhaled, slow and long, the sound of something that had been held tight for a long time, making room. "I'll write again," he said quietly. Samuel Carter made a sound that was not quite a cough and not quite a laugh, and picked up his coffee cup and said nothing. The morning of the wedding arrived with the particular clarity that late August sometimes offered. The heat still present, but with a different quality, a thinning at the edges that said summer was not permanent, that other things were coming, that the world changed whether or not people were paying attention. Clara stood in the back room of the church in her good dress, which was deep blue because she was a widow, and she was practical, and she had spent exactly no time worrying about the dress. She had spent time worrying about other things. Whether she was asking Ethan for something fair, whether two people as damaged as both of them were, in their different ways, from their different wounds, could build something that held. Whether the thing she felt for him was the real kind, or the kind you felt when you had been lonely long enough that decency looked like love. She had turned that last worry over many times. She had been honest with herself about it, which was something she had learned to be, finally, after years of dishonesty for the sake of peace. And every time she turned it over, she came back to the same thing. It was not decency that moved in her chest when he was near. It was not loneliness that made her want to know his thoughts on everything, on the land, on people, on what the territories had been and what they'd cost him, and where he thought the country was going. It was not relief that made her feel, when his arms came around her, that she had arrived somewhere she had been traveling toward for a very long time. She knew the difference. She had lived the difference. This was the real kind. Helen Marsh knocked on the door and said it was time, and Clara picked up her small bunch of wildflowers, which Ethan had left on her porch that morning, without any note, because he did not add notes to things that spoke for themselves, and she walked through the door. The church was full. She had not expected it to be full. She had been in Redridge for a little over 2 months. She knew people, but she had not thought. And then she walked down that aisle and saw the faces and understood that it was not just about her, that the people of Redridge had come because they needed to, because this was the thing you did when you had been wrong about someone for a very long time, and you finally got the chance to be right. You showed up. You put your body in the room. You bore witness to the correction of the record. Ethan was standing at the front of the church. He was in a dark jacket she had not seen before, clean and well-fitted, his dark hair combed back. And he was standing very straight and very still and looking directly at her as she came up the aisle. His expression was the open one, no armor, no held distance, just Ethan, present and certain, looking at her the way he looked at things he had assessed completely and decided were worth everything. She reached him, and he took her hand, and his hand was perfectly steady.
The pastor said the words that pastors said. Clara heard them and also did not hear them. She was aware of Ethan's hand in hers, and the warmth of the crowded room, and the specific quality of the stillness he radiated, even here, even in front of every person in Red Ridge, Texas, with all their eyes and all their formerly wrong opinions bearing.
When the pastor asked him if he took this woman, Ethan said, "I do," in the same quiet, flat, certain voice he used for everything, and it was the most unperformed thing Clara had ever heard said in a church. She said, "I do," and meant every syllable of it. Samuel Carter, in the third row, pressed his hand briefly over his mouth and looked at the ceiling and breathed carefully, which was the closest he came to crying in public, and the woman sitting beside him pretended not to notice, which was kind. After, on the church steps, with the town around them and the August heat and the smell of dust and horses and the particular alive quality of a crowd that had just witnessed something it needed, Deke Patterson came up and shook Ethan's hand with both of his, hard and long, and said nothing, which was the most honest thing Deke Patterson had managed in years. Will Garrett shook Ethan's hand and said, "We're glad you stayed." Tom Hadley, leaning on his cane, looked at Ethan and said, "Fence is still holding, by the way. Good work." Ethan said, "I know." Clara stood beside him with his hand in hers and watched Red Ridge do its reckoning, person by person, handshake by handshake, and felt the enormity of what it took to outlast a lie. Not to fight it, not to shout it down, just to outlast it. To be so consistently and completely yourself that eventually the truth had nowhere left to hide. That night, sitting on the porch of the house that was now both of theirs, he had brought 2 bags and a saddle and a framed photograph of Samuel Carter that she had placed immediately on the mantel, because she was not going to have a marriage where the people who mattered were kept at a distance. She leaned against him and said, "You know they're going to talk about us forever." He said. "Red Ridge is going to tell this story to everyone who passes through for the next 40 years. "Probably," he said. "Does that bother you?" He thought about it. Genuinely. The way he thought about everything. Then he said, "Let them talk." A pause. "They'll get it right this time." Clara laughed. It came up from deep in her chest, real and uncomplicated. And she felt him respond to it, felt him breathe differently, felt the arm around her shoulders hold a little tighter, felt the particular satisfaction of a man who had made someone he loved laugh. She pressed closer and looked at the dark shape of Red Ridge, quiet now, the lights going out one by one. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 2 months ago, with 2 bags and a grief she didn't know how to put down. She thought about the man bleeding in the street who hadn't needed saving and had let her step forward anyway, because he understood something she was still learning. That letting someone stand beside you wasn't weakness. It was the hardest kind of trust. She thought about what Samuel had said. Your father would have liked him. She thought about all the ways love had been misrepresented to her, all the loud, performed, public versions of it that had turned out to be empty, all the years she had been told to look for the man everyone admired, and had never once been told to look for the man who showed up at 6 in the morning to fix a stranger's fence. "Ethan," she said. Thank you for staying." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for coming back." The night settled over them, and Red Ridge breathed around them, and the summer held its last warm hours before the world turned towards something new. And Ethan Hale held his wife on the porch of their home, with steady hands and a full heart, and the quietest man in Texas had never needed a single word to say everything that mattered. He had only ever needed someone willing to listen. And in Clara Whitmore, Clara Hale now, he had finally, completely, and irrevocably found her.